September 16th, 1994. Ruwa, Zimbabwe. A Friday morning like any other. Around 1,000 students attended Ariel School, a private primary school serving the children of Ruwa's professional community. That morning, most of the teachers were away at a staff meeting. The children, ranging from 6 to 12 years old, were left to play in the schoolyard during recess. What happened next would be investigated by Harvard psychiatrists, documented by BBC journalists, and argued about by scientists, skeptics, and believers for the next 30 years. Before we go any further, I want to be honest with you about something. I know what you're thinking. You've seen UFO stories before. Blurry photographs, unreliable witnesses, government cover-ups that never quite add up. Stories that fall apart the moment someone asks a hard question. This story is different, and I'll tell you exactly why. The witnesses at Ariel School were 62 children between the ages of 5 and 12. They had no access to UFO media. Many had never even seen a television program about alien life. They came from different backgrounds: white Zimbabwean, black Zimbabwean, South Asian, and they had no opportunity to coordinate their accounts. And yet, when researchers interviewed them separately, one by one, their descriptions matched. In detail, in ways that are extremely difficult to explain. One of those researchers was Dr. John Mack, a Pulitzer Prize-winning Harvard psychiatrist and professor. Not a UFO enthusiast, not a conspiracy theorist, a clinically trained scientist whose entire career had been built on rigorous analysis of human psychology. And when he sat down with these children, he said something remarkable. He believed them. To understand why this event matters, you need to understand where and when it happened. Zimbabwe in 1994 was a country just 14 years removed from independence, a nation still defining itself after decades of colonial rule and a brutal civil war. The community around Ruwa was largely middle class and professional: teachers, engineers, doctors. The Ariel School itself was a well-regarded private institution with high academic standards. These were not isolated, uneducated people in a remote location. They were exactly the kind of community that UFO researchers had rarely been able to access. The morning of September 16th began normally. Teachers left the school grounds for a scheduled staff development meeting. A small number of adult staff remained on site. During the mid-morning break, around 10 a.m., approximately 250 children were playing in the schoolyard. The schoolyard at Ariel had a specific feature that would become important. At the far edge of the property, beyond the playing area, was a stretch of a rough bush, untamed scrubland, with tall grass, rocky ground, and a line of misasa trees. This area was technically out of bounds for students. On September 16th, that boundary became the most important piece of real estate in Zimbabwe. At approximately 10:15 a.m., children playing near the far edge of the schoolyard began noticing something in the sky. Multiple silver or metallic objects moving in unusual patterns, not in straight lines, not at consistent speeds. Several children described them as appearing and disappearing. Some described 3 objects, some described more. Then, according to the children's accounts, one of the objects descended. It landed, or came very close to landing, in the rough bush just beyond the schoolyard fence, in an area the children could clearly see from the playing field. And then something, or someone, got out. The children described the being in remarkably consistent terms. It was small, roughly the height of a 10-year-old child. Its body was thin. It wore a dark, tight-fitting suit. Its head was large relative to its body, and its eyes. Every child who described the being mentioned the eyes. Large, black, overwhelming. Some children described the being moving along the top of the craft. Some said it ran or walked through the grass. Several reported feeling that the being was looking directly at them, and that when it did, they received something. Not words, not sound, but images, feelings, thoughts that weren't their own. Emily Trim, who was 8 years old at the time, would later describe it this way. The being communicated through its eyes, without moving its mouth, without making a sound. And what it communicated, she said, was not a greeting. It was a warning, about the Earth, about what humans were doing to the natural world. 16-year-old Salma Siddiqui, one of the older witnesses, said, "I thought I was going to die, and then I thought, we all might." She was not describing fear of the being, she was describing what she understood the being to be communicating. News of the incident spread quickly. Within days, BBC Africa journalists had arrived at the school. Within weeks, the story had reached international media. And within months, 2 serious investigators had made the journey to Ruwa. Cynthia Hind, Africa's leading UFO researcher at the time, was among the first investigators on the scene. She collected 61 drawings from the children, made independently without comparison, asking them to illustrate what they had seen. When she laid the drawings out side by side, the consistency was, she said, impossible to dismiss. Then came Dr. John Mack. The Harvard professor flew to Zimbabwe and spent several days conducting individual interviews with the children, both shortly after the event and in follow-up sessions months later. His methodology was rigorous. He used no leading questions. He allowed the children to describe the experience in their own words, in their own time. His conclusion, which he published and defended publicly despite significant professional risk, was that these children were not lying, were not suffering from mass hysteria, and were not describing something they had seen in a film or read in a book. They were describing, in his clinical assessment, a genuine anomalous experience that he could not explain within conventional frameworks. One exchange, captured on video, has become perhaps the most watched piece of evidence from the entire case. Dr. Mack asks a girl named Frances, 11 years old, what she felt when the being looked at her. She pauses, then she says that we were doing wrong, looking after the world, that we mustn't be doing all this to the world. She is not performing, she is not reciting, she is 11 years old, and she appears to be describing the weight of something she does not fully understand. Let's talk about what the evidence actually shows and what it doesn't. Fact: 62 children reported the incident. Fact: their drawings, made independently, showed consistent features. Fact: Dr. John Mack, a Harvard professor with no prior interest in UFO phenomena, assessed the children as credible witnesses. Fact: BBC journalists interviewed the children on camera within days of the event, and the footage shows children who are not performing, not contradicting themselves, and not displaying signs of coached testimony. What the evidence does not show: physical trace evidence at the landing site. No soil samples were collected in time. No photographs were taken of the craft or beings during the event itself. The children's accounts, however consistent, remain testimonial, which means they are compelling but not scientifically conclusive by conventional standards. Here is what makes this case genuinely different from most UFO reports. The children of Ariel School did not fade into silence. Decades later, in interviews conducted for the 2022 documentary Ariel Phenomenon, directed by Randall Nickerson, the same witnesses, now adults in their 30s and 40s, tell the same story. The details have not drifted. The emotion has not faded. Emily Trim became an artist. Her paintings return again and again to that morning in 1994. Salma Siddiqui became a scientist. She says the experience made her ask questions about consciousness and communication that conventional science still cannot answer. In 2022, when the documentary was screened in cities around the world, audiences who had never heard of the Ariel School sat in silence after the credits rolled. Not because they had been told what to believe, but because 62 children, now 62 adults, were still saying the same thing, and no one has been able to explain it. We live in a world that asks us to choose sides. Believer or skeptic, open-minded or rational. And the Ariel School incident is exactly the kind of case that makes that choice impossible, if you're being honest with yourself. If 62 children had reported seeing a stranger on school grounds, we would call it a credible security incident. We would take their testimony seriously. We would not demand physical evidence before acknowledging that something happened. But because what they described doesn't fit inside our current model of reality, we hesitate. We look for the simpler explanation. And 30 years later, we still haven't found one. Dr. John Mack spent the rest of his career studying what he called anomalous experience. Events that human beings report with complete sincerity that cannot be accommodated within the conventional scientific framework. He died in 2004, struck by a drunk driver in London. He never recanted. He never apologized for believing the children of Ariel School. Emily Trim, now in her 30s, said in 2022, "The being showed her images of a dying world, of destruction, of a planet that had been stripped of something essential. And she has spent her adult life trying to paint what she saw, not because she expects to be believed, but because she feels she was shown something that she is responsible for passing on. Whether you believe a craft landed in the bush behind Ariel School on September 16, 1994, that is your call to make. But 62 human beings looked at something that morning, and 30 years later, they are still looking.